There is a version of the Vietnam War that most people think they know. They know it from photographs and protest songs, from films that turned the jungle into myth, from memorials carved in black granite. They know it as a tragedy, as a mistake, as a war that America lost because the people back home stopped believing in it. That version is incomplete. Not because it gets the dates wrong or misnames the battles, but because it treats the war as something that was misunderstood, rather than something that was deliberately, systematically, and at every level of command, misrepresented. The distinction matters enormously. A misunderstood war produces lessons. A misrepresented war produces silence. And the silence around Vietnam, the particular quality of it, the way it settled over veterans when they came home and never fully lifted, had a specific origin. It came from things they had seen, things they had done, things they had been told to do, and then things they had been told never to speak about again. This script is not about the war as it was sold. It is about the war as it was lived and then buried. To understand how deep the misrepresentation went, you have to start before the soldiers ever landed in Southeast Asia. You have to start in the briefing rooms, in the Pentagon planning sessions, in the State Department cables, in the rooms where men with clean uniforms and advanced degrees sat around tables and made decisions that they already suspected would not work. The war in Vietnam did not begin with a miscalculation. It began with a series of known unknowns that were reclassified as certainties so that policy could move forward. The domino theory was not a military assessment. It was a political metaphor that got promoted into strategic doctrine because it was simple and because it justified action. The generals in the field knew the situation on the ground did not match the theory. Many of them said so in private. Almost none of them said so in official reports, because official reports traveled upward through chains of command where optimism was rewarded and pessimism was career-limiting. The war was misrepresented before the first American combat soldier stepped off a transport plane. The first thing veterans were told never to share was the reality of what the war actually was at the operational level. Not a war to hold territory. Not a war to destroy an enemy army. Not a war to win hearts and minds, despite what the official language said. The war, as it was actually fought on the ground, was a war to produce numbers. Specifically, it was a war to produce a body count. The body count became the central metric of success in Vietnam under General William Westmoreland, who commanded U.S. forces from 1964 to 1968. The logic was simple on paper. If American forces killed more enemy combatants than the enemy could replace, eventually the enemy would run out of people willing to fight. This was called the crossover point, the theoretical moment when enemy casualties would exceed enemy recruitment and the war would tip irrevocably in America's favor. The crossover point was always just ahead, always reachable with a little more effort, a little more firepower, a little more time. It never arrived. Because the logic was wrong, and the men doing the counting knew it was wrong, and they kept counting anyway. The body count system corrupted everything it touched. This is not a retrospective judgment. Officers in the field wrote about the corruption while it was happening. Soldiers talked about it in letters that their families kept for decades. The problem was structural. A unit's performance was measured by how many enemy soldiers it killed. Promotion, recognition, favorable assignment, all of it tracked back eventually to bodies. So bodies were found or manufactured. Enemy dead were counted and recounted. Civilians killed in firefights were reclassified as enemy combatants after the fact, because the logic was circular. If they were in the area when American troops were operating, they must have been hostile. And if they were hostile, they counted. The phrase, "if it's dead and it's Vietnamese, it's VC," circulated widely enough among American units that veterans from different theaters, different years, different branches of service, all remember some version of it. It was not the official policy. It was the unofficial operating assumption that the official policy had created. The pressure to produce body counts cascaded down through every layer of command. A battalion commander needed numbers to show his brigade commander. A brigade commander needed numbers to show his division commander. A division commander needed numbers to show MACV, the Military Assistance Command Vietnam, which needed numbers to show the Joint Chiefs, who needed numbers to show the Secretary of Defense, who needed numbers to show the President. At every level, the numbers were adjusted, rounded up, aggregated, combined with other numbers, stripped of context, and presented as evidence of progress. By the time a set of combat statistics reached Robert McNamara's desk, it bore only an abstract relationship to what had actually happened in a particular jungle clearing on a particular afternoon. McNamara, who had come from the Ford Motor Company and believed deeply in the power of quantitative analysis, received these numbers and believed them, or said he believed them, which had the same operational effect. The soldiers who produced the original numbers knew what they were doing. Some of them were troubled by it. Most of them learned to stop being troubled by it, because being troubled by it changed nothing except your own psychological state. A young lieutenant who refused to inflate his unit's body count did not change the system. He put himself at odds with a system that had enormous power over his career and his daily life. The path of least resistance was to understand the game, play the game, and not talk about the game afterward. Veterans were not warned to keep silent about body count inflation because it was a secret. It was an open secret, known at every level. They were warned to keep silent about it because acknowledging it publicly would have unraveled the entire narrative of the war, the narrative of measurable progress, of enemy forces being ground down to the crossover point, of American strategy working. The silence was not about protecting individuals. It was about protecting the architecture of justification that kept the war going. Alongside the body count problem ran another reality that received almost no official acknowledgement. The enemy, specifically the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong, were far more capable of absorbing casualties than American planners had assumed. This was not a surprise to everyone. Some analysts had predicted it. They had pointed to the historical record, to the way the Viet Minh had fought the French for nearly a decade, absorbing enormous losses without breaking, to the cultural and political factors that produced motivated fighters willing to endure conditions that would have destroyed unit cohesion in most Western armies. These analyses were noted, filed, and largely set aside because they were inconvenient. They suggested that the war of attrition was not going to work, and if the war of attrition was not going to work, American planners did not have a coherent alternative strategy. So the analyses stayed filed, and the attrition strategy continued, and the body counts kept climbing, and the crossover point kept receding. What soldiers discovered on the ground was that the enemy they were fighting was not demoralized by casualties the way American commanders had predicted. They found villages that had been fighting occupying forces, French first and then American, for longer than most of the soldiers had been alive. They found a population that had developed sophisticated methods of survival, of concealment, of resistance, that had nothing to do with conventional military doctrine. They found that the Viet Cong infrastructure was not an army in any Western sense. It was a political and military organism that was embedded in the villages, that drew its strength from local grievances and local knowledge, and that could not be destroyed by killing the people it was currently made of, because it would simply recruit new people from the same pool of grievances. This was understood intuitively by many soldiers after their first few months in country. It was almost never reflected in official assessments. The pacification program, the effort to secure Vietnamese villages and win the loyalty of the rural population, was the other half of the American strategy, and it failed for reasons that were known to the people running it almost from the beginning. The fundamental problem was that American forces were destroying the villages they were supposed to be saving. When a village was suspected of harboring Viet Cong, it was subjected to artillery fire, airstrikes, search and destroy operations, relocation programs that moved populations away from their ancestral lands, and a dozen other interventions that were militarily understandable and politically catastrophic. The Vietnamese peasant who watched American forces level his village, kill his livestock, and move his family to a strategic hamlet did not become a supporter of the South Vietnamese government. He became, at minimum, a passive supporter of the Viet Cong, and more often an active one. This pattern repeated itself across the country thousands of times, and it was documented in reports that went into files, and the files went into archives, and the war continued anyway. There was a specific program called Operation Phoenix that veterans who served in or near it were strongly discouraged from discussing publicly for years afterward. Phoenix was an intelligence and counterinsurgency program run jointly by the CIA, the South Vietnamese government, and American military advisors. Its purpose was to identify and neutralize the Viet Cong infrastructure, meaning the political and administrative network that supported the guerrilla war. Neutralization was the official term. It meant capture, defection, or death. The program ran from 1968 to roughly 1972, and by official count it neutralized somewhere between 80 and 90,000 members of the Viet Cong infrastructure, with somewhere between 20 and 40,000 killed, depending on whose figures were used and how they were compiled. The program produced real intelligence gains and disrupted real networks. It also produced a systematic practice of assassination, torture, and the killing of people who were identified as VCI, Viet Cong infrastructure, on the basis of information that ranged in quality from solid to completely fabricated. Provincial reconnaissance units, which were the paramilitary forces that carried out many Phoenix operations, had quotas. Quotas meant that if real targets were not available, other targets were found. Local vendettas were settled under the cover of Phoenix operations. Personal enemies were denounced as VCI. People with no connection to the Viet Cong were killed because someone in their village wanted their land or their wife or their position. The program's administrators knew about these abuses. Reports documenting them reached American supervisors. The program continued. Veterans who had worked with Phoenix or adjacent to it came home carrying information that had no acceptable public context. What they had participated in did not fit the categories available in American culture for talking about the war. It was not heroic combat. It was not accidental atrocity. It was organized, bureaucratically administered, systematically conducted killing of people who were sometimes enemies and sometimes simply people who were in the wrong place with the wrong information attached to their names. The veterans were not ordered to stay silent in a formal sense. They simply understood that the silence was expected, and they understood the consequences of breaking it, and most of them maintained it for decades. Some of them maintained it until they died. The massacre at My Lai in March of 1968 became the public face of American atrocity in Vietnam, which was itself a form of misrepresentation. My Lai was real. It was horrific. Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry, under the operational command of Captain Ernest Medina and directly led by Lieutenant William Calley, entered the village of My Lai and killed between 300 and 500 unarmed civilians over the course of several hours. The victims were old men, women, children, and infants. There was no firefight. There was no enemy contact. There was a village, and there were American soldiers who had been told the village was a Viet Cong stronghold, and then there was a massacre. The army knew about it almost immediately. Ronald Ridenour, a soldier who had heard about My Lai from participants, wrote letters to Congress and the Pentagon in April 1969, more than a year after the massacre occurred. The army investigated and eventually charged 30 men. One of them, William Calley, was convicted. He served 3.5 years of house arrest and was then pardoned. The other 29 charges were dropped. What veterans were warned never to discuss was not My Lai itself, once it became public. It was the fact that My Lai was not exceptional. The mechanisms that produced My Lai, the free fire zones, the pressure to produce body counts, the dehumanization of Vietnamese civilians as potential or actual enemy combatants, the destruction of the boundaries between combatants and non-combatants that guerrilla war produces, these mechanisms were operating across the entire theater of war, not in one company. The Vietnam Veterans Against the War held the Winter Soldier investigation in Detroit in January and February of 1971. Over 100 veterans testified about atrocities they had witnessed or participated in. including the killing of civilians, the torture of prisoners, the destruction of villages, and systematic patterns of conduct that violated the laws of war. The testimony was detailed, specific, and largely corroborated by documentary evidence. It received minimal mainstream media coverage, was dismissed by the Pentagon as exaggerated or fabricated, and was largely forgotten within a few years. The men who testified knew that speaking had consequences. Several of them were investigated by military intelligence. Some of them lost jobs or security clearances. The silence closed back around the rest. The treatment of prisoners is another area where official policy and operational reality diverged so dramatically that veterans who knew the truth simply had no way to discuss it without implicating themselves and their units in conduct that American law and the Geneva Conventions defined as criminal. The official policy was clear. Prisoners were to be treated humanely, not subjected to torture or coercion, provided with adequate food and medical care, turned over to South Vietnamese authorities or American detention facilities in a timely manner. The operational reality was that prisoners were routinely subjected to brutal interrogation in the field before they were ever transferred anywhere, that the South Vietnamese detention facilities to which they were transferred were sites of systematic torture, and that American advisors attached to those facilities knew what was happening, and in many cases participated in it, directed it, or designed it. The tiger cages of Con Son Prison Island, where prisoners were held in concrete cells too small to stand in, subjected to lime thrown from above, denied adequate food and water, became a brief public scandal when American journalists photographed them in 1970. The public moved on. The cages remained. The psychological cost of living inside a gap between what soldiers were told they were doing and what they were actually doing is something that American military culture had, and largely still has, no framework for processing. The military's psychological support apparatus in Vietnam was designed to address battle fatigue, the breakdown of soldiers under acute combat stress. It was not designed, and could not be designed within its institutional constraints, to address the particular kind of moral injury that comes from participating in or witnessing conduct that a soldier knows to be wrong and has no power to stop or report or refuse without destroying his own situation. The term moral injury was not in wide use during Vietnam. It was developed later, specifically in part by researchers trying to understand why Vietnam veterans had outcomes so much worse than veterans of other wars. The concept is simple. Moral injury is the damage done to a person's moral framework when they are forced to participate in, witness, or fail to prevent actions that violate their own deeply held moral beliefs. It is distinct from post-traumatic stress disorder, though it often co-occurs with it. PTSD is a fear-based condition. Moral injury is a shame and guilt-based condition. Vietnam produced both on a massive scale, and the military was equipped to address neither. Veterans came home from Vietnam carrying not just memories of violence, but a specific kind of cognitive dissonance. The knowledge that what they had done and what they were supposed to say they had done were two different things. The debrief process, such as it was, asked soldiers to provide after-action information relevant to tactical assessment. It did not ask them how they felt about what they had done, or whether what they had done had seemed right or wrong, or whether they had followed rules of engagement, or had found the rules of engagement to be entirely disconnected from the situation on the ground. The institution did not want to know, and individual soldiers rapidly learned that the institution did not want to know, and they adjusted accordingly. The rules of engagement in Vietnam were a document that underwent constant revision, that varied by region and by commanding officers' interpretation, and that were presented to soldiers as both morally obligatory and practically unworkable. Free fire zones, officially designated as specified strike zones, were areas where anyone present was presumed to be hostile and could be killed without further authorization. The designation of an area as a free fire zone required official authorization, but the application of free fire logic extended far beyond officially designated zones in practice. A soldier operating in the Vietnamese countryside where the enemy wore no uniform, used civilians as cover, cached weapons in villages, and moved through a landscape in which everything looked the same, and any person might be a fighter, or might be a farmer, or might be both on alternate days, had no reliable way to distinguish who could be killed and who could not. The rules of engagement provided categories. The categories did not map onto the reality. The soldier in the field developed his own working categories based on experience and the guidance of NCOs and the particular culture of his unit, and those working categories bore varying relationships to anything that could have been officially sanctioned. The tunnel systems of Cu Chi represent another dimension of the war that veterans were discouraged from discussing in full, not because the tunnels themselves were secret, but because what happened inside them complicated the clean narratives that were available. The tunnel network under Cu Chi District in the Third Corps was one of the most sophisticated underground military installations ever constructed. By the time American forces began extensive operations in the area in 1966, the tunnels stretched for hundreds of miles, contained hospitals, command centers, weapons caches, sleeping quarters, meeting rooms and kitchens. Tunnel rats, the soldiers who volunteered or were assigned to go into the tunnels to clear them, operated in complete darkness with a pistol and a flashlight in spaces sometimes not much larger than their own bodies. What they encountered varied from empty passages to Viet Cong fighters to booby traps to the bodies of previously killed soldiers who had not been recovered. The psychological experience of tunnel clearing was, by any measure, one of the most extreme experiences of the war. Veterans who had done it described something that could not be communicated to people who had not done it. An experience of isolation and threat and disorientation that left permanent marks on people who seemed outwardly functional for years afterward. More broadly, the underground nature of the Viet Cong infrastructure illustrated something that American military doctrine was fundamentally unsuited to address. The enemy did not hold ground in a way that could be captured and held. It dissolved when pressure was applied and reconstituted when pressure was released. American forces could sweep an area, kill or capture everyone they found who appeared hostile, destroy any structures they found, and leave. And within weeks the area would look functionally similar to the way it had looked before they arrived. The military term for this was the mowing the grass problem. You cut the grass, and the grass grows back. The solution that some commanders proposed, and that was extensively debated within the military, was more permanent approaches to population control, including forced relocation, the Strategic Hamlet Program, and ultimately proposals that went considerably further than any of those. Proposals that were not publicly discussed and that exist now mainly in documents that required decades to declassify. Agent Orange was presented to the public and to the soldiers who were exposed to it as a safe and effective defoliant. The purpose was legitimate from a strictly military standpoint. Dense jungle canopy provided cover for enemy movement, and eliminating the canopy made it harder for enemy forces to move undetected. Operation Ranch Hand ran from 1962 to 1971, and during that period American aircraft sprayed approximately 19 million gallons of herbicides across Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, of which Agent Orange constituted the largest single component. Agent Orange contained dioxin, a compound that is one of the most toxic substances known to human chemistry. The soldiers who worked with Agent Orange, who had it sprayed over their positions, who swam in water contaminated by it, who handled the drums it was stored in, were told explicitly that it was not harmful to humans. This was not an honest mistake arising from incomplete knowledge. Documents from the Monsanto Corporation, one of the primary manufacturers, show that internal company scientists had identified the toxic properties of dioxin years before the large-scale use of Agent Orange in Vietnam. The Department of Defense had access to studies that raised serious questions about the health effects. The program continued. Veterans who began to develop cancers, neurological disorders, skin conditions, and a range of other illnesses in the years after their service faced a government that denied any connection between their exposures and their conditions for more than a decade. The Veterans Administration regularly denied claims linking Agent Orange exposure to illness through the 1970s and 1980s. The internal logic was straightforward and morally grotesque. Acknowledging the connection would have required the government to acknowledge that it had knowingly exposed hundreds of thousands of soldiers to a toxic substance while telling them it was safe, and it would have triggered a compensation liability that the VA estimated at billions of dollars. The denial was not scientific. It was economic and institutional. Veterans who pursued claims were told they lacked documentation, that their illnesses could have other causes, that the link had not been established to the required standard of proof. The standard of proof required was, conveniently, one that required documentation that the military had not kept. Many veterans died before their claims were resolved. The children of Agent Orange veterans and the Vietnamese population that was exposed to contamination that persisted in soil and water for generations represent a dimension of the war's consequences that remained almost entirely outside American public consciousness for decades. Vietnamese children born with birth defects attributable to dioxin contamination were a direct consequence of American military operations. The contamination of certain Vietnamese soil and water sources persisted long enough that children born well after the war's end, to parents who had themselves been born after the war, showed elevated rates of birth defects in the most heavily contaminated areas. This was not unknown. Studies documenting it began appearing in the scientific literature in the 1980s. The American government did not acknowledge it as a significant policy concern until many years later, and the remediation of the most heavily contaminated sites in Vietnam did not begin until the second decade of the 21st century. The war in the air, the bombing campaigns, represent another area where the gap between official description and operational reality was vast and systematically maintained. The air war over North Vietnam, conducted mainly through Operations Rolling Thunder from 1965 to 1968 and Linebacker from 1972, was presented as a precision campaign designed to destroy military and industrial targets while minimizing civilian casualties. The reality of bombing accuracy in that era, conducted with iron bombs from high altitudes against a country with sophisticated air defenses, was that precision was a fiction. Studies conducted during and after the war showed that large percentages of ordnance fell outside designated target areas. Civilian casualties from the bombing of North Vietnam were never officially counted by the American government. Estimates from other sources, including North Vietnamese records and international observers, suggest numbers in the hundreds of thousands. These estimates were contested, which was itself a form of deflection. The bombing destroyed civilian infrastructure, including hospitals, schools, and residential areas, and this was documented by American pilots, by journalists who traveled to Hanoi, and by international observers. The documentation was acknowledged and set aside. The bombing of Cambodia and Laos was a different and in some respects more extreme case. The B-52 bombing campaign against Cambodia, Operation Menu, began in March 1969 under President Nixon and was kept secret from Congress and the American public for more than a year. The campaign involved dropping enormous quantities of explosives on a country that the United States was not at war with, that had declared its neutrality, and that American policy publicly respected. The bombs were falling on Cambodian territory because Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces used Cambodian jungle as sanctuary and supply routes, which was true and was also irrelevant to the question of whether bombing Cambodia without congressional knowledge or authorization was legal. The falsification of records to conceal the bombing required the cooperation of hundreds of military personnel, from pilots to mission planners to record keepers, all of whom falsified official documents showing that the bombs had fallen in Vietnam rather than Cambodia. When the secret became public in 1973, the military personnel who had falsified the records faced no meaningful consequences. The records had been falsified on orders from the chain of command, which meant that responsibility was distributed widely enough that accountability was effectively impossible. The bombing of Laos was even more extensive and even more thoroughly concealed from public awareness. The United States dropped more ordnance on Laos during the Vietnam War era than the total ordnance dropped in the entire Second World War, making it, per capita and per square mile, the most heavily bombed country in history. Much of this bombing was conducted as part of the effort to interdict the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the network of supply routes that ran through Laos and Cambodia from North Vietnam to the south. The bombing did not stop the trail. North Vietnamese forces repaired damage faster than it could be inflicted, and the trail continued to function throughout the war. The civilian population of Laos, particularly in the plain of Jars, was devastated. Hundreds of thousands of Laotian civilians were displaced, killed, or wounded. The unexploded ordnance problem in Laos, the cluster munitions and bombs that failed to detonate and lay in fields and forests and village paths for decades afterward, continues to kill and maim people to the present day, mostly children who find objects they do not recognize. The American public was not informed of the scale of the Laotian bombing during the war. The declassification of relevant documents required decades. Within Vietnam itself, the Strategic Hamlet Program deserves more extended treatment than it usually receives, because it illustrates so precisely how every element of the American approach to the war failed simultaneously. The program was designed to address the fundamental problem of the guerrilla war, which was that the Viet Cong derived its strength from its ability to move through and draw support from the rural population. The solution, borrowed in part from British experience in Malaya, was to move the rural population into fortified villages, strategic hamlets, where they could be protected from Viet Cong influence and where the government could provide services, education, and security that would win their loyalty. The program's logic was not absurd. It had worked, in modified form, in certain contexts. In Vietnam, it failed catastrophically, for reasons that should have been predictable and in many cases were predicted. Vietnamese peasants had deep attachments to their land and to the graves of their ancestors, which were located on family land. Forced relocation broke something fundamental in the relationship between the population and the government asking them to move. The new hamlets were often badly constructed, inadequately supplied, and poorly defended. The government officials who ran them were often corrupt, taking the supplies and money intended for hamlet development and selling them or keeping them for themselves. The Viet Cong penetrated many hamlets within weeks of their establishment because the same population that had been relocated was the same population from which the Viet Cong recruited. By 1963, official South Vietnamese reports were claiming thousands of strategic hamlets in operation. Independent assessments found that a large fraction of these did not exist in any meaningful sense, that the numbers had been fabricated at the provincial level to show progress that the provincial officials could not actually demonstrate. The program officially collapsed after the coup that killed President Diem in November 1963, though some version of it continued under different names for years. The relationship between the American military and the South Vietnamese government and armed forces constitutes another dimension of the war that veterans understood and were not supposed to discuss. The official position was that the United States was assisting a legitimate government in defending itself against communist aggression, that the South Vietnamese people had a genuine desire for the kind of government the South represented, and that the Army of the Republic of Vietnam was a fighting force that, with adequate training and support, could defend its country. Veterans who worked closely with ARVN units knew that this picture was incomplete to the point of being false in important respects. ARVN unit performance varied enormously, from units that fought with genuine skill and determination to units that avoided contact, fabricated engagements, sold their weapons and ammunition on the black market, and ran when fighting became serious. The variation existed in American units as well, but the dynamics were different. ARVN soldiers were fighting a civil war in their own country for a government that large portions of the population did not trust, under an officer corps selected more for political loyalty than military competence, against an enemy that in many cases had been fighting longer and believed in its cause more completely. These were not secrets. They were documented extensively in reports that went up the chain of command and were noted and not acted upon. The American military's racism toward Vietnamese people, both North and South, is another subject that veterans were discouraged from acknowledging because it complicated the narrative of Americans as protectors and liberators. The dehumanization of the enemy is a feature of every war because killing requires some degree of psychological distance from the humanity of the person being killed, and that distance is created and maintained through language and cultural framing. In Vietnam, the language was particularly systematic and particularly pervasive. The various terms used for Vietnamese people, terms that ranged from mildly dismissive to aggressively dehumanizing, were not slang used only by individual soldiers. They were embedded in the operational culture of the military, used by officers in briefings, in official documents, in casual conversation at every level of command. The effect was to create a cognitive framework in which Vietnamese lives had less value than American lives, in which Vietnamese civilian deaths were less problematic than American civilian deaths would have been, in which the distinction between combatant and non-combatant was easier to collapse when applied to Vietnamese people than it would have been applied to a European population. This framework had direct operational consequences. Rules of engagement were more loosely applied in areas with high civilian populations because the civilian population was not conceptualized as fully civilian in the same way an American population would have been. Artillery and air support were called in on populated areas with a frequency and a casualness that reflected this underlying devaluation. The estimates of civilian casualties that filtered up through command were routinely minimized, not through overt falsification in many cases, but through the application of the presumption of hostility to anyone in the area. If they were there, they were hostile. If they were hostile, they were not civilians. If they were not civilians, their deaths did not count as civilian deaths. The arithmetic was clean, and it was entirely disconnected from reality. Drug use in Vietnam has been discussed in general terms, but the specific institutional response to it, the way the military first ignored it, then suppressed information about it, then addressed it in ways that created new problems, is less well known. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, drug use had reached levels that were impossible to ignore. Marijuana had been widely used from relatively early in the American combat involvement. By 1969 and 1970, heroin, available cheaply and in high purity through networks that included South Vietnamese military officials and their connected criminal organizations, had become prevalent in some units. Studies conducted by the military found rates of heroin use that, if accurate, would have indicated that a significant fraction of American forces in Vietnam were addicted to heroin. These studies were initially suppressed because they were, at the institutional level, unmanageable. Acknowledging that a substantial portion of the fighting force was addicted to heroin would have raised questions about the war that the military was not prepared to answer. When the issue became public enough that suppression was no longer sustainable, the response was the creation of amnesty programs and treatment protocols that addressed the individual soldier's addiction while studiously avoiding examination of the conditions that had produced it. The conditions were not mysterious. Soldiers who had been in Vietnam for extended periods, who had seen things that they could not process through available psychological resources, who were living in a state of constant uncertainty and moral incoherence, who had access to extremely cheap and potent drugs, were using those drugs to manage an experience that was otherwise unmanageable. The treatment programs treated the drug use. They did not, could not, address the experience that the drug use was a response to. Veterans who came home addicted found VA facilities that were inadequately equipped to treat their addiction, systems that were designed for a different generation of veterans with different problems, and a public that viewed heroin addiction with a mixture of fear and contempt that made honest discussion of how they had become addicted essentially impossible. The fragging phenomenon, the killing or attempted killing of officers and NCOs by enlisted soldiers under their command, is one of the most explicit indicators of how completely the war had eroded in the period from roughly 1969 to 1973, and it is one of the subjects that military culture had and continues to have the most difficulty processing honestly. The official count of fragging incidents, based on records that most analysts believe undercount the actual number significantly, runs into the hundreds. Some estimates suggest over 1,000 incidents. The range of what counted as fragging varied in the records, from detonating grenades in officers' quarters to booby-trapping officers' equipment to direct assault. The phenomenon was most common in rear areas and in units with high drug use and low morale in the period after the American public had clearly turned against the war, and the announced policy was to turn the fighting over to the South Vietnamese through Vietnamization. What fragging represented was the complete breakdown of the authority relationship that military organization depends on. Soldiers were killing their own commanders. This was not happening because individual commanders were incompetent or cruel in ways that made them personally disliked, though sometimes that was a factor. It was happening because the entire framework of authority had lost its legitimacy, because the soldiers could not see any relationship between what their commanders were asking them to do and any coherent purpose, because the war had long since ceased to make sense to the people being asked to fight it and had in some cases never made sense to them, and because the only thing that remained was the naked fact of being in danger and having authority exercised over you by people who seemed either not to know or not to care. The military classified information about fragging to the extent it could, investigated incidents perfunctorily, and generally preferred to treat each incident as an individual disciplinary matter rather than acknowledge the systemic character of what was happening. The fall of morale across the American military during this period was broader than the fragging incidents suggest. Unit cohesion in many formations was severely degraded. The racial tensions that had been building in American society throughout the 1960s were reproduced and intensified inside the military in conditions where they could turn violent. Black soldiers who served in disproportionate numbers in combat roles and who were disproportionately subject to military discipline while seeing white soldiers receive more favorable treatment, organized, protested, and in some cases refused orders in ways that had no precedent in American military history. These incidents were documented in internal military reports with a kind of institutional horror. The military was not built to accommodate or process the level of internal dissent that was developing. The response was largely suppressive, which addressed the immediate manifestation of the problem without touching the underlying conditions. The Tet Offensive of January 1968 is commonly understood as the turning point at which American public opinion swung decisively against the war. This is largely accurate and also somewhat misleading, in the way that the conventional account of Vietnam is misleading generally. Tet was a military defeat for the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces in a narrow tactical sense. The offensive failed to achieve its primary objective of triggering a popular uprising in the South. Viet Cong forces particularly were decimated by the losses they sustained, to the point that the Viet Cong as an organization never fully recovered, and subsequent operations increasingly fell to the North Vietnamese army. What Tet demonstrated was not that the enemy had the capacity to win a conventional military engagement. What it demonstrated was that virtually everything that American commanders had been saying about the progress of the war was false. Tet happened in places that were supposed to be secure. It was carried out by forces that were supposed to have been significantly degraded by attrition. It reached the American embassy compound in Saigon, which was the symbolic heart of the American presence in South Vietnam. The gap between what had been officially described and what Tet revealed was simply too large to explain away. General Westmoreland, who had been publicly describing the war as going well, and who had briefed Congress and the public on the approach to the crossover point, just weeks before the offensive, found himself in an impossible position. His attempt to describe Tet as a significant military defeat for the enemy was technically defensible and strategically irrelevant, because the offensive had already done its primary damage, which was to the credibility of American claims about the war. Walter Cronkite's editorial broadcast in February 1968, in which he described the war as a stalemate, is often cited as the moment public opinion shifted. What it actually was the moment the public face of the war caught up with what many analysts and some journalists had been saying privately and in obscure publications for years. The Vietnamization policy that Nixon introduced after taking office in January 1969 deserves examination as another example of a policy that was presented publicly as a solution and was understood privately by its architects as a mechanism for managing American withdrawal without the appearance of defeat. Vietnamization meant progressively turning the fighting over to South Vietnamese forces while American forces drew down. The theory was that with adequate training, equipment, and support, the South Vietnamese army could handle the war on its own. The people designing the policy knew, with a degree of certainty that approached conviction, that this was not going to work in the way the public description implied. The South Vietnamese government was unstable, politically fragile, dependent on American support for its legitimacy, and commanding a military that was deeply compromised in ways that years of American training had not and could not fix, because the problems were not ones that training could fix. They were structural, political, and cultural problems that went to the foundation of what the South Vietnamese government was and who it represented. Vietnamization was designed not to win the war, but to create conditions under which the United States could exit the war without the exit looking like what it was. Henry Kissinger, who negotiated the Paris Peace Accords, later said things in private that were substantially more pessimistic than anything he said publicly about the prospects for South Vietnam's survival after American withdrawal. The peace accords themselves were presented as an honorable settlement that left South Vietnam in a position to defend itself. The people who negotiated them knew that North Vietnam had not abandoned its goal of reunifying the country under its control, that the accords provided a face-saving framework rather than a durable peace, and that the question was not whether the South Vietnamese government would eventually fall, but when and how. The fall came in April 1975. It was not a surprise to the people who had been paying attention. The fall of Saigon produced its own official silence. The helicopters lifting people off the roof of the American embassy, the scenes of chaos and abandonment at the airport, the images of people trying to reach departing aircraft. These images were allowed to exist in the public record in a way that most of the previous 8 years of misrepresentation had not been. They were allowed to exist, perhaps, because they were uncontrollable, because there were too many cameras and too many witnesses. But the narrative that surrounded them immediately began the process of reframing, turning the fall of Saigon from the logical conclusion of 2 decades of failed policy into a story about betrayal and abandonment, about whether sufficient willpower had been applied, about whether the peace movement had stabbed the military in the back. The stab in the back narrative, which had a well-documented history as a post-defeat mythology in other contexts, allowed the war to end without requiring the institutions that had managed it to account for what they had done. The veterans who came home to this environment, who had carried for months or years the knowledge of what the war had actually been, who had participated in body count inflation or pacification operations or Phoenix or Agent Orange exposure or any of a dozen other programs that the official narrative could not accommodate, found a country that was not asking the questions that would have required honest answers. The country was exhausted by the war. It wanted to not think about it anymore, which was understandable and also convenient for the institutions that had managed it. The veterans who tried to talk, who participated in Winter Soldier or testified before Congress or wrote books or gave interviews, found audiences that were either uncritically sympathetic in a way that avoided the hard parts or dismissive in ways that questioned their credibility. There was very little space for the kind of precise, factual, morally complex account that the war had actually been. The POW and MIA issue became, in the years following the war, another layer of misrepresentation built on top of the existing layers. The question of whether American prisoners of war had been left behind in Vietnam after the 1973 prisoner exchange was a legitimate question that deserved honest investigation. What it became was something different. It became a political and cultural mythology that served multiple purposes simultaneously. allowing veterans and their families to maintain a kind of open accounting that never required closure, providing a framework for anti-Vietnam government sentiment, and generating a narrative in which the war's veterans were both victimized and heroic in ways that the actual war's complexity had not easily allowed. The Senate Select Committee on POW/MIA Affairs, which investigated the issue extensively in the early 1990s, concluded that while the accounting for all personnel was not complete, the evidence did not support the contention that prisoners had been knowingly left behind by the American government. The committee's conclusions were immediately disputed by advocates who had built their identity around the opposite belief, and the mythology continued. The specific experiences of women who served in Vietnam, particularly nurses, constitute a dimension of the war's history that was almost entirely absent from public awareness for the first decade after the war and has never been fully integrated into the dominant narrative. Approximately 11,000 American women served in Vietnam, the majority as nurses with the Army, Navy, and Air Force Nurse Corps. They worked in field hospitals and evacuation hospitals and in country under conditions that produced their own forms of psychological damage. They received wounded soldiers from the field and worked to keep them alive in facilities that were themselves sometimes under attack, that were understaffed, undersupplied, and operating under the same systemic pressures that affected everything in Vietnam. Nurses who lost patients had no structured support. They were expected to process what they had experienced and keep working. Many of them came home with conditions that would later be recognized as PTSD and moral injury, and they encountered a VA system that had not been designed to treat women veterans, that did not initially recognize them as combat veterans for purposes of benefits, and that in some cases denied that their service could have produced the symptoms they were reporting. The Korean and other Allied forces in Vietnam present another understudied dimension. South Korea sent substantial forces to Vietnam, eventually deploying over 300,000 troops over the course of the war. Korean forces operated primarily in the Second Corps in the central coastal region and developed a reputation for aggressive and effective counterinsurgency. They also developed a reputation, documented by American and Vietnamese sources, for extreme harshness in dealing with the civilian population, including massacres of villages suspected of supporting the Viet Cong. These incidents were known to American command at the time. The political relationship between the United States and South Korea and the strategic importance of Korean forces to the American effort in Vietnam meant that the incidents were not investigated seriously and were not reported publicly. Korean veterans of Vietnam have faced their own government's reluctance to acknowledge the atrocities conducted by Korean forces in Vietnam, with legal and political battles over acknowledgement and compensation continuing into the 21st century. The reconstruction of what happened during and after the war in the documentary record required decades of work by historians, journalists, and veterans advocates, much of it depending on Freedom of Information Act requests, declassification processes, and the eventual willingness of aging participants to speak about things they had kept quiet for years. What emerged from that process was not a radically different narrative in its basic outlines. The war had gone the way everyone knew it had gone, but it was radically different in its texture, in the specific detail that revealed how systematically the institutions involved had managed information to maintain a narrative of coherence and progress that had no relationship to the actual situation. The specific cables, the specific memos, the specific after-action reports, the specific internal assessments that contradicted what was being said publicly, produced, when finally read, a portrait of institutional dishonesty that was not the product of individual bad actors making individual bad decisions. It was the product of systems operating exactly as they were designed to operate, producing the outputs they were designed to produce. The Rand Corporation studies of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong motivation, conducted through thousands of prisoner and defector interviews over years, produced findings that were classified and largely kept from public and even from most policy audiences, because what they found was that North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters were fighting for reasons that were coherent, consistent, and deeply felt, and that the American approach was not going to change those reasons by any available means. They found that enemy fighters believed in what they were doing, that they had a political and historical framework for their struggle that gave it meaning, that the hardships they endured were manageable within that framework, and that the American assumption that attrition would eventually break their will was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what motivated them. These findings were known to senior policymakers from relatively early in the large-scale American commitment. The policy did not change. The long-term health consequences for Vietnamese people of the chemical warfare conducted during Operation Ranch Hand extend well beyond the Agent Orange story, as it is usually told. The defoliants used included several different chemical compounds, not just Agent Orange, and they were applied to large portions of the country's agricultural land, forest cover, and watershed areas. The ecological damage to Vietnam was extensive and long-lasting. The destruction of mangrove forests in the Mekong Delta, which served as nurseries for fish that much of the population depended on for protein, had food security consequences that lasted years. The stripping of forest cover from highlands increased erosion and changed rainfall patterns in ways that affected agriculture for a generation. These consequences were not the primary purpose of the defoliation program, but they were foreseeable consequences, and the decision to accept them was made at levels of command that also accepted the human health consequences. The question of what the war was ultimately haunted everyone who participated in it, and haunts still the historical understanding of it. The official answer changed several times. It was to prevent communist expansion in Southeast Asia. It was to honor American commitments to the South Vietnamese government. It was to demonstrate American resolve to allies and adversaries worldwide. It was to buy time for Vietnamization to work. Each answer was true in a limited sense and inadequate in a fundamental sense, because none of them established a clearly achievable objective against which progress could actually be measured as opposed to claimed. The war continued because stopping it required admitting that the previous years of sacrifice had not achieved what they were supposed to achieve, and that admission was always going to be made by someone else at some future point, after just a little more effort, just a little more time. This logic operated in every administration from Eisenhower through Ford, and it consumed 58,000 American lives and millions of Vietnamese lives, and left behind it a silence that required decades to begin to break. The veterans who kept silent were not weak. The veterans who kept silent had made a calculation about the available options and had chosen the option that allowed them to function within the lives that were available to them. The calculation was reasonable. Speaking meant reopening experiences that were not going to be processed in any constructive way by the available cultural mechanisms. It meant potential legal exposure. It meant being dismissed or disbelieved or made into something, either a villain or a victim, that did not capture what they actually were, which was people who had been put in impossible situations by institutions that had not been honest with them about what those situations were, and who had done what people in impossible situations do, which is survive however they could. The silence protected them in the short term and damaged them in the long term, and they knew this, many of them, and it made the silence heavier rather than lighter. The medical literature on Vietnam veterans that accumulated over the decades documented outcomes that were statistically distinguishable from those of veterans of other wars in ways that aligned with what anyone paying attention to the psychological literature on moral injury and institutional betrayal would have predicted. Higher rates of suicide, higher rates of substance abuse, higher rates of homelessness, higher rates of relationship dissolution, higher rates of the specific cluster of symptoms associated with PTSD. These outcomes were not random. They were the measurable residue of specific experiences, specific traumas, specific moral injuries that had not been addressed and could not be addressed within the frameworks available. The VA, when it finally began to take Vietnam veterans' mental health seriously, was working years or decades behind the problem. The veterans who did speak, who wrote memoirs and testified and gave oral history interviews and made art and literature out of what they had experienced, produced a body of work that constitutes one of the most extensive insider accounts of institutional failure ever assembled for any war. The books alone, from Tim O'Brien's fictionalized accounts to Philip Caputo's direct memoir to Karl Marlantes' fiction that was clearly memoir by another name, to hundreds of less well-known works, described a war that was recognizable in its landscape and utterly alien in its logic. A war where the objectives were unclear and the metrics were corrupt, and the institutional culture required participants to pretend to a clarity and purpose that did not exist. Reading these works together, reading them against the declassified documents and the congressional testimonies and the investigative journalism, produces a picture of the war that is substantially complete and substantially at odds with the official account that governed public understanding while the war was happening. The bombing of civilian infrastructure in North Vietnam reached its peak with Operation Linebacker II in December 1972, 11 days of B-52 strikes against Hanoi and Haiphong that were presented as a military necessity to force North Vietnam back to the negotiating table. The operation was conducted in violation of bombing halt commitments that had been in effect, and it was justified publicly with arguments that understated the civilian toll and overstated the military value of the targets. The American pilots who flew the missions knew what they were hitting. Some of them wrote about it afterward. The Bach Mai Hospital in Hanoi, one of the largest medical facilities in North Vietnam, was destroyed in the bombing. The destruction of a hospital is a war crime under international law. The American government did not acknowledge that the hospital had been intentionally targeted, claiming it had been damaged incidentally. The physical evidence, including the pattern of bomb craters and the destruction pattern of the hospital itself, was inconsistent with the incidental damage claim. The claim was maintained officially regardless. The Paris Peace Accords, signed in January 1973, ended direct American military involvement in Vietnam while leaving the underlying political conflict completely unresolved. The North Vietnamese signed them, understanding that the military and political struggle would continue, and that the departure of American forces would eventually produce the outcome they had been working toward since 1945. Kissinger won a Nobel Peace Prize for his role in negotiating the agreement. The Peace Prize was jointly awarded to Le Duc Tho, the North Vietnamese negotiator, who declined it on the grounds that peace had not actually been achieved. The Nobel Committee's 2 members who disagreed with the decision resigned. The war continued for 2 more years after the peace accords, in a form that the American public was largely not following. And it ended with the outcome that anyone who had been paying honest attention knew it was going to end with. The South Vietnamese civilians who had depended on American protection, who had worked with American forces and American agencies and the American-backed government, were not adequately evacuated in the final days before the fall. The planning for the evacuation had been complicated by the desire not to signal to the South Vietnamese government and military that the Americans were preparing to leave, because such a signal might accelerate the collapse. The result was that the evacuation was conducted in conditions of extreme chaos, that many people who had been promised protection were not reached, that the final helicopter lifts from the embassy roof took American personnel and a relatively small number of Vietnamese nationals, while many more waited outside the embassy walls. The people who were not evacuated faced consequences that ranged from re-education camps to imprisonment to execution. This outcome was known to be likely by the people managing the evacuation. The priority was the departure of American personnel. The communist government that took control of unified Vietnam in 1975 and 1976 conducted its own set of atrocities and repressions that were real and that do not in any way retroactively validate the American conduct of the war. The re-education camps held hundreds of thousands of people in conditions of severe deprivation. Political repression was systematic. The economic policies of the early years of unification created poverty and suffering that contributed to the exodus of the boat people, hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese who fled the country by sea in conditions of extreme danger, many of them dying before reaching any destination. These realities were real, and they existed in a context that included the fact that Vietnam had been continuously at war in one form or another since the early 1940s, that the country's infrastructure and agricultural base had been extensively damaged by American operations, and that the regional political dynamics placed Vietnam in continuing conflict with Cambodia and China in the years immediately following reunification. None of these contextual factors excuse the repression. They explain the environment in which it occurred, the Thai bases and the broader regional infrastructure of the American war in Southeast Asia, the covert operations in Laos, the relationship with the Thai military, the operations out of bases in Thailand that were officially acknowledged only in the most general terms, represent another layer of the war that existed substantially outside public awareness. The scale of the American covert involvement in Laos was enormous. The CIA ran a secret war there that at its peak involved tens of thousands of Hmong fighters under American direction, operating against North Vietnamese forces and Pathet Lao. The Hmong soldiers and their families paid an enormous price for their alliance with the United States. When the American involvement in the region ended, the Hmong were left to face the consequences of having been America's proxy force. Consequences that included sustained persecution, forced relocation, and violence that drove a substantial portion of the Hmong population out of Laos as refugees. The American commitment to the Hmong, like the American commitment to South Vietnam, was real in the short term and non-existent when it became inconvenient. The Vietnamese-American community that formed from the waves of refugees who came to the United States after 1975 carried with them a specific experience of the war and its aftermath that has been only partially integrated into American public understanding. Their experience includes the war, the fall, the re-education camps, the boat journeys, the refugee camps, and the decades of building lives in a country that had burned their country and then accepted a fraction of them as refugees. The relationship between Vietnamese Americans and the war's history is complicated by the fact that the community contains people with very different relationships to the conflict, former ARVN officers and former Viet Cong supporters, people who lost family members in American bombing, and people who lost family members in communist prisons. The community carries within it the full complexity of the war in a way that American public culture generally does not. The specific units, the specific officers, the specific orders that produced the worst documented atrocities of the war have never been fully accounted for. The Tiger Force, a long-range reconnaissance platoon of the 101st Airborne Division, conducted a 7-month campaign in the Central Highlands in 1967, during which members of the unit killed, tortured, and mutilated civilian non-combatants on a scale that investigators later described as systematic rather than episodic. The Army's own investigation, conducted in 1971 and 1973, identified 27 soldiers who might have been prosecuted for war crimes. None of them were. The investigation was closed. The Army classified the documents. The documents remained classified for decades. When they were finally obtained by journalists from the Toledo Blade in 2003, they produced a Pulitzer Prize-winning series and almost no policy consequence. The soldiers were old men by then. The Army expressed regret that the investigation had not been pursued. The investigation had not been pursued because pursuing it would have required acknowledging that the systematic commission of war crimes by American forces was not an aberration, but a pattern. And that pattern had produced the body count metrics that the Army had used to measure its progress. The final years of the war, from 1971 to 1975, saw a progressive hollowing out of American military capacity in Vietnam that was visible to everyone in the theater and was managed in official communications with the same combination of selective disclosure and deliberate misrepresentation that had characterized the entire period. Units that were nominally on patrol were in practice sitting still. Operations that were reported as aggressive pursuit of the enemy were in practice defensive. The South Vietnamese Army, which was supposed to be taking over the full burden of the war through Vietnamization, was doing so on paper faster than it was doing so in the field. because the paper numbers reflected what was needed politically rather than what was happening operationally. The Easter Offensive of 1972, in which North Vietnamese forces launched a massive conventional assault across several fronts, nearly broke the South Vietnamese army before American air power intervened to stabilize the situation. The intervention required the personal involvement of Nixon and Kissinger to overcome institutional resistance and bureaucratic inertia. It worked, in the sense that the South Vietnamese lines held, and it demonstrated conclusively that the South Vietnamese military could not function against a serious conventional threat without direct American support. This demonstration was noted, filed, and did not change the public Vietnamization narrative. The war consumed a specific generation of Americans and Vietnamese in ways whose full consequences are still being measured. The American veterans who came home from Vietnam were, on average, younger than the veterans of the Second World War, less prepared by previous civilian experience for what they had encountered, and less supported by institutional and cultural structures for processing it. The average age of an American combat soldier in Vietnam was 19. The average age of a combat soldier in the Second World War was 26. The difference is not merely statistical. It represents a difference in the developmental stage at which human beings are forced to confront extreme violence, moral complexity, and institutional betrayal, and in the consequences that confrontation has for the rest of a life. A 19-year-old who participates in a war crimes cover-up because his commanding officer told him to, and the alternative was unimaginable, is not the same as a 26-year-old in the same situation. The psychological and moral development that separates those ages is substantial. The 19-year-old who became a 45-year-old carrying that weight had been carrying it for 26 years during his most formative adult decades. The war in Vietnam ended. The war about Vietnam, about what it was and what it meant and who was responsible and what should be acknowledged and what should remain silent, did not end when the last helicopter left the embassy roof. It continued in the veterans' hospitals and the VA waiting rooms and the therapy sessions that finally happened decades late, in the declassification battles and the congressional hearings and the investigative journalism, in the oral history projects that finally got people talking in their 60s and 70s about things they had not been able to talk about since they were 20. It continued in the ongoing contamination of Vietnamese soil and the Vietnamese children born with dioxin-related birth defects and the Laotian farmers who still die from cluster munitions that were dropped 50 years ago. It continued in the question that nobody with institutional power has ever fully answered, which is what it means to conduct a war that everyone involved in directing it understood, at some level of private acknowledgement, was not going to achieve its stated purpose, and to continue conducting it anyway, year after year. Body count after body count, falsified report after falsified report, because stopping required admitting what had been done to arrive at the point where stopping became unavoidable. The names on the black wall in Washington represent the American dead. There is no equivalent wall for the Vietnamese dead, because the numbers are too large for any wall. Because the political frameworks that built the American memorial could not accommodate the acknowledgement that the Vietnamese dead on all sides were also people with names and families and lives that were ended by the same war. Estimates of total Vietnamese deaths, civilian and military, North and South, attributable to the American period of the war alone, run from 1 to 3 million, with the most careful scholarly assessments clustering around 2 million. These numbers exist in the historical literature, and they do not exist in American public consciousness in any operative way. They were not the subject of a monument. They were not the occasion for a process of public reckoning. They remain statistical, which is a way of remaining safely abstract. The soldiers who participated in the war and who carried specific knowledge of specific events returned to civilian life and built whatever lives they could build. Some of them talked eventually. Some of them never talked. Some of them talked in ways that their audiences could not fully receive, because the audiences lacked the framework to understand what was being communicated. because the war's actual texture, its specific moral quality, its particular combination of bureaucratic absurdity and genuine horror and institutional indifference, did not translate into the available categories. The veterans who found each other, who built the informal networks of mutual understanding that required no translation, found something that civilian life and official recognition had never quite provided, which was the ability to be in the presence of people who knew, without needing to be told, what the words meant when they were said, and who did not require the words to be packaged in a form that made them more comfortable for people who had not been there. The war that was fought and the war that was reported were two different wars that occupied the same geography and the same years. The soldiers lived in one, the public received the other. The gap between them was not an accident of communication or a failure of journalism or a problem of the fog of war. It was maintained deliberately and systematically by institutions that understood the gap and managed it as a feature rather than a bug. Because the alternative, honest accounting of what was happening in Vietnam, was incompatible with the continued prosecution of the war. And the continued prosecution of the war had become, for the institutions involved, an end in itself, disconnected from the original purposes that had justified beginning it. The last American combat forces left Vietnam in March 1973 following the Paris Peace Accords. American military advisors and support personnel remained. American air support continued for South Vietnamese operations in Cambodia until Congress cut off funding in August 1973. American military aid to South Vietnam continued until 1975. The CIA maintained its presence and its operations throughout this period. The war, for American institutions, did not end cleanly at any point. It tapered, reduced, continued in attenuated forms, and finally became impossible to maintain when the Congress voted to cut funding and the South Vietnamese army collapsed under the weight of a conventional invasion that American air power was no longer authorized to counter. The final accounting of what had been spent, 58,000 American lives, somewhere between 1 and 3 million Vietnamese lives, hundreds of billions of dollars in contemporary value, 20 years of American foreign policy shaped by the requirements of the Vietnam Commitment, was never formally presented to the American public as a reckoning. The war simply stopped, and the silence that had always accompanied it became the dominant mode, and the institutions that had managed it moved on to the next set of obligations, carrying with them the same structures, the same incentives, and the same relationship between official description and operational reality that had produced Vietnam in the first place.